Right now, as of this morning, meteorologists across Southern California are watching the same signal converge from multiple directions at once. A building ridge of high pressure, an offshore flow pattern setting up, and temperatures that are about to jump 5 to 10 degrees within days. By Tuesday, forecasters say a larger area of high pressure moves directly into the region. By Thursday, that heat is expected to peak, with valley and inland empire communities returning to triple digits and desert areas pushing well past 100, Palm Springs specifically forecast to hit 109. This isn't a distant hypothetical forecast sitting weeks out on a model run. This is happening this week, confirmed in the National Weather Service's own current outlook, and it's arriving as part of a broader pattern that's been repeating across Southern California all summer. Today, we're breaking down exactly what's coming, day by day, region by region, why this specific kind of heat surge has become such a persistent feature of this particular summer, and what you actually need to know to stay safe through it. No exaggeration, just the current forecast and the real science behind it. If you're anywhere in Southern California, tell me in the comments what conditions have looked like where you live. And subscribe now if you want to keep tracking this as it develops. Let's get into it. Let's start with exactly what the National Weather Service and Southern California meteorologists are forecasting right now, region by region, because the specifics matter considerably more than a general sense that it's going to get hot. According to the latest forecast, a combination of high pressure and offshore flow is already moving into the region, bringing gradually warmer temperatures starting this week. The real jump comes by Tuesday, when a larger area of high pressure moves directly into Southern California, causing temperatures to climb 5 to 10 degrees by the middle of the week. High temperatures are expected to peak specifically on Thursday, with the heat then sticking around for several additional days before a slight cool down begins heading into the following weekend. Breaking that down by specific region, coastal Los Angeles and Orange County will see a relatively mild start, with a high of 88 degrees and a low of 68 to begin the week, before climbing back into the low 90s by Tuesday and holding there through the rest of the work week. That might not sound dramatic on its own, but for coastal LA and Orange County, sitting in the low 90s for multiple consecutive days represents a genuine departure from the marine layer-cooled mid-70s to 80s conditions those communities typically expect for much of the summer. The valleys and inland empire, an area that includes the San Fernando Valley, the San Gabriel Valley, and communities across Riverside and San Bernardino counties, start the week with a high of 95 degrees and a low of 69, before climbing all the way back into triple digits by Thursday. The day forecasters expect the overall heat surge to peak. Beach communities will see the mildest conditions of anywhere in the region, with a high of just 77 degrees and a low of 68 to start the week. A mix of morning fog burning off into afternoon sunshine, the kind of pattern that keeps the immediate coastline noticeably cooler than areas even a short drive inland throughout this entire event. Mountain communities begin the week with a high of 81 and a low of 53, before climbing into the mid-80s by midweek. And desert areas, including the Coachella Valley, start at a high of 100 degrees with a low of 66, with Palm Springs specifically expected to reach 109 degrees as the heat builds toward its Thursday peak. It's worth understanding exactly what's driving this specific pattern meteorologically, because it's not simply summer being summer. The mechanism at play here, a building ridge of high pressure combined with offshore flow, is a well-understood, recurring setup for Southern California heat events, but it's worth walking through exactly how the two pieces work together to produce the kind of rapid 5 to 10 degree jump forecasters are describing for this coming week. A ridge of high pressure works by trapping air beneath it and compressing it, and compressed air warms as it descends. A straightforward physical process that heats the atmosphere from the ground up, regardless of what season it technically is. Offshore flow adds a second compounding effect specifically relevant to coastal and near-coastal Southern California because it reverses the region's normal onshore sea breeze. The flow of relatively cool marine layer air moving in from the Pacific that typically moderates temperatures across coastal and near-coastal communities throughout the summer. When that flow reverses and starts moving from the interior desert out toward the coast instead, it strips away exactly the cooling influence coastal communities normally depend on, allowing heat to build in areas that would otherwise stay comparatively mild even during an inland heat wave. That combination, with compressing ridge-building heat from above and offshore flow removing the coastal moderating influence from the side, is precisely why this week's forecast shows even beach communities and coastal Los Angeles climbing into the low 90s. A genuinely uncomfortable departure from what those specific areas typically experience. This week's surge doesn't exist in isolation either, and understanding the broader pattern this summer has followed helps explain why meteorologists aren't treating this as an unusual, one-off event. Southern California has experienced a genuinely persistent, repeating cycle of heat waves throughout the summer of 2026, with multiple rounds of extreme heat warnings, heat advisories, and triple-digit inland temperatures stacking up one after another since early summer. Earlier heat events this season pushed temperatures to some of the hottest readings of the year in specific inland communities, with extreme heat warnings, the most serious tier the National Weather Service issues for this specific hazard, covering large sections of the Antelope Valley, the high desert, and the broader inland empire during multiple separate stretches since June. That pattern of repeated, closely spaced heat events, rather than one isolated summer heat wave, followed by a return to more typical conditions, reflects a persistent atmospheric ridge that has repeatedly rebuilt itself over Southern California and the broader Southwest throughout the season. Precisely the kind of recurring, stubborn pattern that has kept this region under some form of heat advisory or warning for a meaningfully larger share of this summer than a typical year would produce. There's a broader climate signal worth understanding behind this recurring pattern too, because it connects directly to one of the most significant atmospheric events unfolding globally this year. As covered in earlier reporting, 2026 is running through one of the most powerful El Niño events ever recorded, with Pacific Ocean temperatures in the key monitoring region already exceeding the intensity seen at the same point in 2015, 1997, 1991, and 1982. Some forecast models suggesting this could ultimately become the strongest event since organized record-keeping began in 1950. That matters directly for California specifically, because a strong El Niño reshapes the broader atmospheric circulation pattern governing weather across the entire West Coast, producing exactly the kind of amplified ridging, building and collapsing in unusual places, holding longer than typical, rebuilding faster after brief cooldowns. That has characterized Southern California's repeated heat cycles this summer. It's also worth noting that this same El Niño pattern carries implications well beyond just this week's temperature forecast, with recent reporting specifically flagging concerns that a strong El Niño could bring record sea levels to the California coast in the months ahead. Adding a coastal flooding dimension to the broader set of hazards, this year's unusually powerful Pacific signal is expected to produce across the state. It's worth being direct about why heat waves like this one deserve to be taken just as seriously as more visually dramatic weather events, because heat rarely generates the same kind of urgent public reaction that a wildfire or a flood does, despite being considerably more dangerous in aggregate. Heat is, most years, the deadliest weather hazard in the United States, killing more people annually than hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods combined, precisely because its dangers build gradually and often go unrecognized until symptoms become severe. Heat-related illness escalates in stages, starting with heat cramps and progressing through heat exhaustion before reaching heat stroke, the point at which the body's internal temperature regulation system fails entirely, and organ damage becomes a genuine risk without rapid medical intervention. Vulnerable populations face disproportionate risk during exactly this kind of extended heat event. Older adults, young children, people with chronic health conditions, outdoor workers, and anyone without reliable access to air conditioning all face meaningfully elevated danger as this week's heat builds toward its Thursday peak and holds for several days afterward. There's also a direct, well-documented connection between prolonged heat events like this one and wildfire risk across Southern California, a connection worth understanding, given how frequently this region's summer heat waves have coincided with active fire activity this year. Sustained high temperatures accelerate the drying of vegetation across the region's chaparral and grassland landscapes, converting what might otherwise be moderately flammable fuel into genuinely dangerous, rapidly ignitable material within a matter of days. Combined with a kind of offshore flow pattern driving this week's heat surge, the same wind pattern capable of rapidly spreading any fire that does ignite, this specific meteorological setup represents almost exactly the combination fire officials watch most closely throughout Southern California's peak fire season. Earlier heat waves this summer directly coincided with the ignition and rapid growth of significant wildfires across Central and Southern California, including large fires that prompted evacuation orders in multiple communities, illustrating precisely how a heat forecast like this week's carries implications well beyond simple discomfort, feeding directly into the broader fire danger picture for the entire region. CAL FIRE and local fire agencies routinely elevate staffing and pre-position resources ahead of exactly this kind of forecast, treating the combination of building heat and offshore wind as a genuine operational trigger, rather than waiting for a fire to actually ignite before responding. It's worth walking through exactly what practical precautions actually matter during a heat event structured like this one, because the specific pattern, building through Tuesday, peaking Thursday, lingering for several additional days before easing into the weekend, calls for sustained attention rather than a single day of caution. The National Weather Service and regional health officials consistently recommend a specific set of practices during extended heat events like this. Limit strenuous outdoor activity to the early morning hours, ideally completing any necessary outdoor work or exercise before 9 or 10 a.m., since temperatures in this kind of pattern can climb dramatically within just a couple of hours as the sun gets higher. Stay hydrated consistently throughout the day rather than waiting until you feel thirsty, since thirst itself is already a lagging indicator of dehydration. Avoid sugary or caffeinated beverages, which can actually worsen dehydration rather than helping. Wear loose-fitting, light-colored clothing that reflects rather than absorbs heat. Never leave children, pets, or anyone else inside a parked vehicle, even briefly, given how quickly interior temperatures can climb to genuinely lethal levels even on a moderately warm day, let alone during a peak heat Thursday with triple-digit inland temperatures. And check on elderly neighbors, relatives, and anyone without reliable air conditioning access throughout the event, not just on the single hottest day, given that this forecast specifically calls for the heat to persist across multiple consecutive days rather than spiking once and immediately breaking. For anyone without home air conditioning, or anyone specifically concerned about energy costs during an extended heat event like this one, most counties across the region maintain designated cooling centers specifically for exactly this kind of situation. Public libraries, community centers, and senior centers that stay open extended hours and welcome residents seeking relief from the heat during official advisory periods. Checking with your specific county's public health department or emergency services website for the nearest currently operating cooling center is worth doing proactively before the Thursday peak arrives, rather than waiting until conditions have already become genuinely dangerous. It's also worth understanding what the actual official designations mean once the National Weather Service does formally issue them for this event, since heat advisory and extreme heat warning represent two genuinely different tiers of hazard rather than interchangeable terms. A heat advisory is issued when forecast conditions are expected to create a significant risk of heat-related illness if precautions aren't taken, generally covering scenarios where daytime highs and overnight lows combine to produce sustained heat stress without adequate recovery time overnight. An extreme heat warning represents the more serious tier, reserved for the most dangerous conditions, extended periods of significantly above average temperatures, often combined with elevated humidity, that pose genuine, immediate life-threatening risk, particularly to vulnerable populations, even for people taking reasonable precautions. Given the forecast trajectory for this coming week, temperatures climbing into triple digits across inland valleys and the Inland Empire by Thursday, holding there for multiple days afterward, this kind of extended multi-day heat event is exactly the scenario that has repeatedly triggered both advisory and warning level designations across the region throughout this summer. And residents should expect official alerts to be issued as the week's specific forecast continues to firm up closer to the Tuesday through Thursday core of the event, likely covering the same general areas, the Antelope Valley, the High Desert, and the broader Inland Empire that have carried the bulk of this summer's prior advisories and warnings. It's worth taking a moment to explain why forecasters can already speak with this much specificity about a heat event still several days out, because that level of confidence isn't always available for every kind of weather forecast. Ridge-driven heat events like this one are considerably more predictable than, say, an individual thunderstorm or a fast-developing tropical system, because the underlying driver, a large-scale area of high pressure building over a broad region, is a slower-moving, more massive atmospheric feature that computer models can track with real confidence several days to a week in advance. That's fundamentally different from trying to forecast the exact path of a small, fast-moving disturbance, and it's why meteorologists can already lay out a specific day-by-day temperature progression, mild start to the week, jump by Tuesday, peak on Thursday, gradual easing into the weekend, with genuine confidence this far out, rather than the kind of vague, hedge-everything language that shorter-range, smaller-scale weather features often require. It's also worth explaining exactly why the same ridge produces such dramatically different outcomes depending on which specific part of Southern California you're standing in, because the spread between this week's beach forecast, upper 70s, and the desert forecast, past 100 with Palm Springs at 109, represents a genuinely enormous swing for locations that, as the crow flies, can sit less than 100 miles apart. Elevation plays a meaningful role, with mountain communities generally running cooler than the valleys below them, even under the same ridge. But the single biggest factor is proximity to the ocean and the specific way this week's offshore flow pattern interacts with that proximity. Coastal and near-coastal areas normally benefit from a persistent marine layer, an onshore breeze that keeps temperatures moderated throughout summer, acting almost like natural air conditioning fed by the relatively cool Pacific Ocean. Areas further inland, cut off from that marine influence by distance and by the mountain ranges separating the coastal basin from the desert, don't have access to that same moderating effect, and instead sit directly under the compressing, warming influence of the ridge with nothing to counteract it. When offshore flow reverses the normal onshore breeze, as this week's forecast describes, Even the areas that would normally benefit from marine moderation lose access to it, which is exactly why this week's forecast shows coastal LA and Orange County climbing into the low 90s rather than holding in their more typical midsummer 70s and 80s. There's also a specific reason meteorologists have been tracking this recurring ridge pattern with particular attention throughout the summer of 2026, beyond simply noting that it's been hot. A ridge that repeatedly rebuilds itself over the same general region, rather than a single heat wave that builds, peaks, and then gives way to a genuinely different weather pattern for an extended stretch afterward, reflects a specific kind of atmospheric blocking behavior, where the broader large-scale flow-steering weather systems around the globe get stuck in a configuration that keeps regenerating similar conditions over the same geographic area again and again. That's precisely the kind of pattern behavior associated with the kind of amplified El Niño-driven atmospheric circulation covered earlier, and it's part of why this summer's heat has felt less like a single notable event and more like a persistent, recurring condition punctuated by only brief periods of relief before the next buildup arrives. It's also worth addressing a practical question that comes up during every one of these recurring heat events: why the same forecast temperature can feel meaningfully different depending on humidity levels, even when the raw thermometer reading is identical. The human body cools itself primarily through evaporating sweat, and that evaporative cooling process becomes measurably less effective as humidity rises, since more moisture already present in the surrounding air makes it harder for sweat to evaporate off the skin. That's precisely why the National Weather Service and health officials pay close attention not just to the forecast high temperature itself, but to the combination of temperature and humidity, particularly during any stretch where overnight lows also stay elevated. Since a body that never gets a genuine overnight cooling period to recover from daytime heat, stress faces compounding risk across consecutive hot days in a way that a single very hot day followed by a cooler night simply doesn't produce. This week's forecast, with overnight lows generally staying in the upper 60s across the valleys and inland empire even as daytime highs push into the triple digits, represents exactly the kind of pattern where that overnight recovery period matters as much as the daytime peak itself for understanding genuine health risk. So what should you actually do with this forecast right now, several days ahead of the actual peak? First, if you have outdoor plans, travel, events, or physical activity scheduled for Wednesday or Thursday specifically, this is the moment to consider rescheduling to earlier in the week or shifting the timing to early morning hours before conditions in the valleys and inland empire push into the triple digits. Second, take basic preparation steps now, rather than waiting for the heat to actually arrive. Checking that your home cooling system is functioning properly, stocking up on water and any medications you might need, and identifying your nearest cooling center if you don't have reliable air conditioning access. Third, if you live in or near any of Southern California's fire-prone areas, treat this week's combination of building heat and offshore flow as a genuine elevated fire risk period, avoiding any activities that could produce a spark and staying aware of official fire weather warnings that may accompany this heat event, given how directly these two hazards have been connected throughout this summer's repeated heat cycles. And fourth, remember that the coast, while still expected to warm into the low 90s by midweek, remains meaningfully cooler than valley, inland empire, and desert communities throughout this entire event. Information worth keeping in mind if you have any flexibility in where you spend the hottest days of this coming week. We will keep tracking this heat event as the National Weather Service's forecast continues to firm up through the week, along with any official advisories or warnings issued as Tuesday's high-pressure buildup and Thursday's expected peak draw closer. Given how many times this exact ridge pattern has rebuilt itself across Southern California already this summer, it's also worth watching whether this week's event fits the same recurring cycle or marks the beginning of a genuinely different stretch heading into the back half of August. If this gave you a clearer picture of exactly what's coming and when, subscribe so you don't miss the next update, and drop a comment letting me know what the heat has looked like in your specific part of Southern California this summer. Stay cool, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.